You're listening to Pneuma, the crossroad of science and enlightenment. This podcast is a place where science meets soul and healing meets hope, where the latest in science meets ancient wisdom to illuminate the path toward healing and transformation. We break through stigma and misinformation to explore the transformative power of psychedelic therapy, holistic health, and the mind-body connection. Through stories, insight, and expert conversations, we provide practical solutions to help you reclaim your mental health, embrace your spirituality, and achieve true enlightenment. Hosted by Alan Wiederhold, author of the book Walking in the Garden, Discovering God Through Psychedelics. Alan is the consummate explorer, passionate about empowering others to embrace the divinity of their true selves, as well as the founder of Pneuma Health, whose mission is to restore and transform lives. Here's your host, Alan Wiederhold.
Welcome, everyone, to Pneuma, the crossroad of science and enlightenment, where we explore spirituality and neuroscience, psychedelics, and all of the things that have kind of brought me to this journey that we're on. And today, I'm really excited to be able to have with me Dr. Casara Andre, who we talked 2 weeks ago. And you are a highly respected veterinarian, but you're also a trailblazer in alternative therapies for animals. When we talked, we were talking about emerging therapies, psychedelics. We were talking about the amazing work that you're doing with cannabis. And it really got me thinking about all of the things we never think about. So we were kind of joking, you have a cat, I have a 14-year-old love of my life, Italian Greyhound, who I watch as he's getting older. But the conversation that we were having, really, I felt like it was just something that we had to bring on the show and we had to talk about, because I know that this is something that no one ever thinks about. So Dr. Andre, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'm so excited for this conversation too. I enjoyed our last conversation, and Jasper told me you're an amazing person, amazing human. So I'm so excited to continue the conversation.
Thank you. First, tell me, how did you get into this work? So can you share a little bit of your journey, not only in veterinary medicine, but how did you make the transition from where I would argue that it's traditional veterinary medicine to where we are today? I mean, you've done some amazing things.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to take an opportunity to look back on your own career. And sometimes when people ask me that question, I'm like, oh, that was a long time ago. Oh, I've been doing this for a while. That's kind of mind blowing sometimes. I served as a veterinarian for the US Army Veterinary Corps in my early career. So I definitely picked a non-traditional path right through vet school. So I commissioned in my second year of vet school and then did basic training during school and then after school. And it was definitely an intentional choice. I knew that I was looking for something that was outside the box. And I had a couple of mentors, really strong mentors during vet school that had served in the military and had thought that was a good path for me. And it was definitely life shaping. And I sort of picked that word intentionally, good and bad. And it's what you take from it, and mentors that you learn from and want to be like, and mentors that you learn that you want to do something different. And again, I think it's what you decide to take from it. But I will say what I most value about my time in the military experience is learning to interact with working dogs. So we're learning about the partnerships that those dogs form and have to form with their handlers, the complexities of what those bonds can be and look like, how to interact with that bond from a medicine side as a veterinarian. And that definitely has shaped my career from then on out. I also had the opportunity to serve as a trail vet for the Iditarod in 2015. So it was this entirely different partner dog, like the single partner, with a military working dog, police dog style, and then the pack dog, which is just a very different mindset. And then some tracking, trailing dogs when I moved to Colorado. So just the working dog, and particularly the bonds that they form, are just a passion of mine throughout my career. So, that just sort of has shaped other choices that I've made along the way.
Let's talk about that and the choices that you make, because you've had a, I would say, a different path. I was in the military as well. So I love when you say all of your mentors, you can always learn. And I always tell, and I think that's the biggest thing I think I've learned about the military is that You're going to have some who are really, really good, like amazing. And you're going to have some that you're like, you know what? I wouldn't do it that way. and you learn to get along with everyone, because I think the thing I loved most about boot camp and basic and all of the beginning things is that you're all one unit, regardless of where you came from. It doesn't matter what your ideology, it doesn't matter what your socioeconomic, it doesn't matter your color, your gender, whatever. You're in one unit, and each unit is to support that. So kind of walk me through that non-traditional to working with all of these different types of dogs into moving more into the psychedelic space or the cannabis space that you're in. Was that something that you saw in the working dogs in the military? Because I know we have a zero tolerance policy for drugs.
What I saw in the military was a need for a section of medicine that I didn't have. Does that make sense? I think that is how I would say why I ended up in any other non-traditional field. It was really that early experience with my working dogs and their handlers, and this need to work on bond, need to work on training injuries. We're not really surprised by medical conditions for our military working dogs. We know them since they're puppies. So it's not the shocking heart disease or renal disease. It's a training injury or a behavioral health injury or a bonding issue. So it's just this very specific sport medicine as that is on the human side, but really incorporating the importance of that handler bond. So I definitely felt in my time in the military that I was missing something to do in between the dramatic stepped on an IED to like, I'm doing great. And I had a training injury. And so that when I transitioned to the reserves, that definitely was a start of what I was looking for. And I pursued acupuncture first, massage. One of my businesses is an animal massage school, which I just love. It's such a beautiful modality to teach. And cannabis, more about the endocannabinoid system. Cannabis is just a very useful clinical modality to modify that system in an animal's body. And that has just been an amazing, amazing area to work in. But I will say a lot of that came from living and practicing in Colorado. So when Colorado passed their recreational cannabis policies, we saw it impact animals. We saw just decisions people make adjacent to substances, interests of pet parents in using cannabis for their animals. And as the veterinary community, we're like, I don't know what's happening. What is this? We only see intoxications. We don't know how to use it therapeutically. So I had the opportunity to listen really carefully to what the community was concerned about, what pet parents were asking for, the science that was emerging. It's such a fun community to still be a part of. So it's a very, very global industry, and we get to work with practitioners all over the world. And I have to say, psychedelics is not that far off. I am very interested in the therapeutic potential. Canine PTSD, what should we be pulling from human research to apply to animals? But right now it's a lot of harm reduction because, again, I practice in Colorado. There's a lot going on with our psychedelic related policies. There's a lot going on with human ideas around psychedelics, and our animals are enmeshed in our world. They take our risks from our decisions. They benefit from our good decisions. They are inseparable from the things we experience. I'm in it. I'm here for the animals. So that's why I'm here.
And it's so fascinating because we were kind of talking before the show about our dogs have our people. Like,
yes.
And I always joke because we rescued Jasper. He was 10 months old, came from a really bad situation, but fortunately, she knew that she couldn't be a responsible pet owner after 10 months of leaving him basically alone and chewing up all of her stuff, that he had to find a home. We already had 2 other Italian greyhounds, so he got to come into the pack like immediately. But there's always been like this, he's always had this anxiety. He's always been different than the other 2. And I don't think we think about that. Like when we think about pets, we don't think about anxiety and PTSD. And are those real things? Because I would think that if we have those in humans, that we would definitely have those in dogs.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, it's a really interesting question. And again, it's such a fun conversation to have with you. I appreciate your perspective and your very animal-centered perspective. Yes, behavioral health conditions are not exclusive to humans. We definitely see primary behavioral health issues in animals. And that can be something that's just specific to them, unique to their own world, their own experience. But what I find interesting, but also very concerning as a veterinarian, is the spillover of human emotional disease into the animals that live so adjacent to our lives. Now, this could definitely be larger. So human emotional disease affecting planetary health, loss of environment, loss of ecosystem, illegal trade of animals, captivity, all of those pieces. But for this conversation, we can talk just about animals that share our homes and our spaces. Unfortunately, COVID was a really good example of this. And we have some really interesting research post-COVID, right in that quarantine period, that as human mental health declined, humans did better if they had an animal that was their companion. But I'll give you a guess at what happened to the animal's mental health.
Oh my goodness, really?
It got better?
It got
Or
worse.
do you think it got worse?
Wow, really?
Yeah, so we actually saw a lot of decline. And now we have canine anxiety. There's some numbers that's up 700%, which I absolutely believe. Just like it's what do they call it on the human side? The COVID baby? Or just, so it's a COVID puppy. It is just lack of socialization as we were at home. So there's a lot that we impact animals adjacent to us from our own experience as a human to the groups that we're in, et cetera. So it's a fascinating interspecies science, but there's a lot of harm potential there too.
And that's where I think I was so fascinated with the conversation, because I always tell my kids, and it drives them crazy as an 8 and 10-year-old, that everything that we see is not real. It's only a collective of our shared experiences, whether that be your neighborhood, your church, your parents. But I feel like that would also have to fold into your animal as well.
Absolutely.
So all of these experiences, whether they're good, bad, right, wrong, they're all shared. We pass those on to because I see that with my kids and how they rationalize things. As a facilitator, I teach my kids to walk around the block of their emotions. So while that might be frustrating for some people, they always know the story is never the story. But I can see, though, that for people who do not have those skills or the ability to be able to downregulate their emotions, that could be pushed off on their animal, on their pet.
Yeah, for sure.
That's where a lot of this COVID puppy is coming from.
Yes, interesting on the COVID puppy side. I think it demonstrates a really unique aspect of human social interaction, that it demonstrated that we needed that social interaction, and that as a result, the lack of or a deficit can absolutely affect those around us, from our own young to the creatures that we're responsible for, the decisions that we make. But as much as that paper is true and that behavioral health in the animals declined, I also always love to point out that sometimes it got better, and sometimes that relationship actually can be utilized intentionally for the benefit of both. And I'll just reference Jasper for that, of how much better is his life for the work that you and your family have put into helping him bond, for your own, the animals you already had, the effort that they put out to accept him into the pack, and that it can actually be this really beautiful bi-directional, better than could be singly. So just absolutely an entourage. So building better, how do I want to say that? Better sum of the parts, better than the individual, and just being able to really lean into that relationship and both sides improve from it. And that's beautiful. I think that's really, really beautiful.
And from a brain perspective, how much different is the animal brain, canine brain, to the human brain when we're talking about anxiety and those things? Because one of the things I've always noticed, we were kind of talking about this too, as a facilitator, I've watched him he's very incredible. And I know that mammals we co-regulate, but I know that when in medicine, he's definitely more attuned. He's more aware, and I watch him, and it's just fascinating to me that he connects that part to the experience like he knows. So that's why I find that so fascinating. So is there a difference in their brains and how they're able to pick these kind of things up?
Yes, let's unpack that just a little bit. So yes, absolutely, they have a different brain format. Their circuits are different, but they're still mammals. And so I think that's kind of the point of this conversation of mammalian ability to regulate. And also let's add in canines, just for the sake of conversation, how much they've been bred to regulate. So we've domesticated them and genetically selected them to be able to really resonate with us, to intuit what's going on, to be instinctive. And that takes a lot of responsibility. So you do have to really pay attention to what you're doing from a growth side, what they're exposed to, all those pieces to make sure they can form that human-animal bond. But importantly, they don't know all the things going on in our human world. So if they're in just a moment, an experience, and there's a huge loud noise outside, we might be able to look out the window and say, that was the garbage truck. It's fine. But there's a limit of perception that that animal is just physically not able to do, or cognitively not able to understand. The truck will be gone in a moment. So there's some aspects of living very closely in our very human world that we understand, that if we're not really careful to shape their understanding and make sure that there is a consent and a cooperation and that everyone knows what's going on, there's a lot of potential for the things that we're anxious about to rub up onto them. Does that make sense? If their perception,
100%.
if they're not sure what's going on,
you never think about that, because we were kind of joking about the fox. So like we all know it's the fox.
Right.
So listeners, we have this fox that we feed every day. Like it has its own plate outside. We buy hot dogs and cheese and walnuts, and loves almonds, by the way. But Jasper, being 14, will sleep all day. And the second he sees this fox, it's like he's 2 again. And we're all like, it's the fox. And he's just like, hair on the back of his neck is standing up and his tail's wagging. And then he scares the fox away and he's like, I won.
Yes, I did it.
And then he goes back to sleep. So we're all like, yeah, it's the fox. And in his mind, he is completely thinking something different because he doesn't have that perception.
Or we haven't helped him know it. And I think that's a really important part for any of this discussion as animals intersect more closely with psychedelics that humans are using. How clear are we being about expectations? So again, going back to how much an animal can choose to help, right? There are animals that are just like, yeah, you do your own thing. There are animals who absolutely choose to, I want to participate. I am here with you. I am your partner animal. Nothing's breaking our bond. But if we aren't careful about setting up their role in a scenario, just let's think for a moment about how concerning and scary some of those human psychedelic use scenarios could be. And then one of the questions that I always sort of like to just put out there for conversation, how does an animal know, or how do they interface with the phrase, not every hard trip is bad? So as a facilitator, I'm sure you know that phrase. Sometimes it's not bad to go through a difficult moment.
Yes.
But how does an animal know that's what's happening? How do they know how to gauge the support they're giving? And that's the point where it's really easy to see harm come to those animals who really want to make it better, but maybe it's not supposed to be better, or maybe that's the role of the human facilitator. So there's just this really important line to walk of safety for them, while allowing them to serve like their soul wants to. How do we create safety for the pets that are beside us?
And with that, I mean, how does psychedelics impact social bonding? I mean, do they? Again, because when you're saying their soul, I don't think most people think like that. I don't think most people think that animals have a soul, or that they very much do. So how does that impact social bonding? How do psychedelics play a role in that?
I think the spectrum of how it can affect can be wide. Just like in humans, psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier. So right now we're talking about the animal not receiving psychedelics, and that is a really important harm reduction potential. Unless there's very, very careful veterinary guidance, the animal should not receive any substance. What we're really talking about is the animal's ability to perceive the signals from the human as something they understand. And an area that I'm always concerned in some of the social bonding is underlying behavioral health diseases in the animal. So an underlying PTSD, canine PTSD is not uncommon. So if you put that animal with an underlying behavioral health condition with some humans who also have that same condition, now very intentional work together, we think can be mutually beneficial, and that healing of both sides can actually be better than singly. But I think there's also a lot of potential for harm, because that ability to social bond means there's a responsibility on both sides. And PTSD in humans, one of the really difficult pieces is social bonding. But if you also have that fragile nervous system on the animal side, then you really just see the source of conflict rather than healing. And those are actually potentials for animal abuse, animal surrender. It just requires a lot of care when we start thinking about the weight of a bond, the responsibility of a bond, and the duty of care that we have if we are bonded to an animal.
So I was thinking about that initially when you were talking about the working dog with because you have PTSD from a dog with you referenced IEDs with all of the traumas associated. I couldn't even imagine being a working dog and having to see some of the things that we see military, police, everything else, but then their handlers we know are suffering just from both being veterans, some of the organizations we're part of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's just an excellent point. It's from a research perspective, it's interesting because there are not that many conditions that we have where cross species, different species can actually have received the same injury at the same time. So imagine a canine veteran, and importantly, that is the distinction that we give to an animal who has served as a soldier. So a PTSD support dog would be a service animal that maybe supports a veteran after they've retired. But a canine veteran is one that has actively served with their human partner, and they could have both received this psychological or physical injury at the same time. And one of the things I find really fascinating about the psychedelic research world is that we do see a lot of amazing results in its use in humans in working with PTSD. So our question is, well, can we also use that for the animals? Because they're hurting over here too. But also, here's my favorite idea to share. What if those two species healed together? So what if it was less about the individual species healing? And as a facilitator and a veteran, I think that you'll resonate with the idea that the human bonding enough with their facilitator or their therapist to go through this difficult experience doesn't always happen. And you really need that social bond between the humans to kind of make this work, particularly complex PTSD or longstanding PTSD. And then on the animal side, bonding, trust in your trainer, trust in your medical care provider is also an issue. So what if we had these scenarios where that inability to bond is really a tangle, a stopping point? Could we lean on the bond that already exists and really utilize that to the benefit of both? But again, it requires care. We have to recognize what that bond means. And there are physiologic mechanisms of that. And so from a medicine perspective, a veterinary medicine perspective, that's definitely the area that I'm interested in. What can we do to physically support this animal while they're undergoing these psychologic changes or supporting their human through psychologic changes?
From a facilitator perspective, I mean, I have so many thoughts on that because I think the hardest part we always have in any of this is the integration part.
Yes.
So how do you integrate with a therapist or a facilitator, one that you trust, two that's kind of gone through some of the things that you've gone through? So I find that I work with a lot of other veterans, PTSD. I'm a child sexual trauma survivor, so I, for whatever reason, feel comfortable in that environment. But being able to build that trust, but then also being able to kind of weave that back to the animal and almost have a three-party growth and healing at the same time. So incredibly beautiful. Like, I mean, because you're kind of seeing the integration and the healing at the same time.
Absolutely.
With that trust that's already there.
Absolutely. And I have a question for you, Alan. For some of the people that you're facilitating for, the humans that you're helping along this particular integration journey, I would imagine that sometimes it's hard to tell, how are you doing? How are you actually doing? What's actually going on inside, especially if there is significant trauma, trust is an issue, any of those. So one of the things that my team is really interested in is, can we leverage this human-animal bond? Can we leverage the well-being of the animal to actually give us more information about the human patient? Because we see it on the negative side. If there's animal abuse, if there's animal neglect, the odds of a human in that same household also being abused or neglected is very high. But what about the opposite side? If your animal's doing well, if you are taking your animal for a walk every day, if you're really seeing that thriving health in an animal, I guarantee you they're humans doing well too. So could we actually use it as a marker of human well-being? And also, I think you'll resonate with this, the motivation for a human to be better themselves because their animal is better is really strong. And I think that we could utilize that in a really beautiful way if we were intentional.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Jasper, 100%. I mean, I totally, I mean, I could see, because I think ultimately if you're in a happier place or in a better place, you want them to be happy better as well. Kind of a natural thing that happens. What are some of the misconceptions, though, when you talk about animal work, psychedelics, therapy? What are some of the misconceptions that people would have? Because I can just think of like when I tell people what work I do, it's always you have a lot of interesting conversations.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Let me think about that. I would say, well, you mentioned one, probably the top one that comes to mind, just that animals do not have emotions would probably be the top misconception. And a tendency to have a very anthropocentric viewpoint or paradigm, if that makes sense. So a very human centric view of the world. And so it just gives you this very narrow perception of your experience you're in, and even just widening that a little bit to understand that this being that's not human can have its own set of physical needs, emotional needs, and also have its own desires. It can have its own trajectory in life, its own experience. And sometimes we're lucky enough to share that. But I would say that's probably the number one myth, that there is a separateness, an otherness to an animal that really needs a lot of respect. If I'm working on a guinea pig, it's not possible for me to know its experience. Just, it's not. I don't have the same brain circuitry. I do not have the same experience, but I can be setting up how I interact with it, with understand a little bit more about what it needs or wants or asks for. So more asking for consent and cooperation, but it just takes a shift. Right? Understanding that I cannot understand exactly what you need. We are other, but I can still make room for you. I can facilitate helping if we can communicate in a certain way, but it takes time and it takes space and it takes patience and the willingness to go slow. So that would be my first big myth that I think.
How often, so I know that with humans, one of the things that I always find interesting with psychedelics or cannabis is the rewiring of the brain. Mm-hmm. With this neuroplasticity. Is it similar for pets or animals as well? You and I were kind of talking about the window of opportunity, and it's a conversation I always love having. Is it similar for animals as it is for humans? Can they rewire their brains?
Yes, absolutely. So I think you're referencing critical periods, or that's the area that I would pull it into. And yes, animals absolutely have critical periods. Some of our work is really based on the research by Dr. Gul Dolan, if you're familiar with her, a researcher.
I listened to the Aspen. It was so awesome.
Yes.
And then I downloaded her medical paper. Yeah. So,
what a rock star. I just think she's an amazing human and such an amazing scientist. And I so appreciate her work in demonstrating that there's a lot more than just the psychedelic substance in my body experience. That probably more than that moment when you have the substance in your body, the way your brain changes in the weeks after that is probably more important than any of the other aspects. And so we do know that happens to animals. Critical periods are throughout biology. It's not just with psychedelics. Psychedelics just offer a way to potentially rewire those critical periods or reopen them to rewire some of the circuits within. And we do think that has a lot of applications in animals. Canine PTSD being a really big one, pain being another really big one, spinal cord disease. So really the things that we see it being useful for in humans, we're interested in it for animals. However, I would just sort of posit another harm reduction area. How closely are our animals bonded with us? So even if they're not receiving the substance, which again, only with very, very careful veterinary mindset.
I actually wanted to get to that conversation because we talked about this and I walked away. I was like, wow. So, yes.
So if I am experiencing something, my animal is following along beside me. So I'm always really concerned and encourage caution in integration for the human. What are you doing for your animal as well? Because you are an inseparable pair. You are a unit, and being aware of what's going on in your own body, your own spirit, and knowing that that's reflected for your animal just makes us be a little bit more aware of what they might need. How do they need to be supported? What should we be testing for? What subtle signs should we be looking for to make sure that we're not missing anything?
Yeah, the critical period is always fascinating to me because I have another friend that I met who is doing some work with dolphins, critical period between strokes. Mm-hmm. And it was really fascinating. So when I read her scientific paper, it reminded me a lot of that because she's doing work with octopi, which I thought was interesting. But I think the one thing that has always fascinated me about that whole period is that we're so focused on the trip itself that we forget that that's the experience that kind of breaks down the default mode network, or we're able to get to the thing, but then it's the weeks after that are where we actually get the insights and the lessons, things like that.
Absolutely. And particularly for your work with Numa, be making sure the body has the right building blocks to do the thing. That you actually need a certain set of nutrients, you need cells to be working, you need the instructions to be right for change to happen. One of the things that concerns me about the human psychedelic field at the moment is the lack of care for the body that holds that spirit and soul. So you can make whatever changes you want to on that soul, spirit side, whatever your paradigm is there. But if your physical shell is not able to sustain that or actually make the change, if your neurons literally cannot grow, that change is probably not going to happen. And so it does concern me as I see this very rocket launch effect on the human psychedelic side to sort of have the experience and this really high dose experience. And as people are willing to give animal psychedelics in ways that are very harmful or not be aware of how they're affected by being adjacent to us, I think my biggest preaching line is just needs to be supported. That body needs to be hydrated. There needs to be sleep. We need to have safety. We need to have communication. It's not any different for humans, but when we're working with a nonverbal creature, we have to be so intentional and so ethical and so careful to listen to that non-human voice to make sure that we're not missing something they're trying to say.
And what kind of cues, what kind of messages would there be from these animals? I'm just kind of thinking, I know mine because he's my best friend. So.
The opportunity to say no is a powerful gift for any creature, whether that's a human who's in a scenario that they want out of. The ability to not consent, the ability to say, I do not want to participate, is really important. And I think a lot of people, when they hear me say that, would sort of come up with that next myth of animals can't speak, they can't communicate. But it's most often that we're not listening in the right way, or we're not willing to go slow enough to hear or to receive whatever they're communicating. So communication is not just speech. It can be just literally walking away. So absolutely leaving the animal the option to leave, whether that's in a psychedelic experience or just in a stressful household. I mean, some of what we're talking about today can just be a human household that's chaotic. A loss, a death, a grief, someone leaves for college, someone comes back home. Stress in our households absolutely affects our animals. So watching for signs of them not wanting to be present, not wanting to engage. Body posture is a really, really great way to track anxiety and underlying pain, and definitely diagnostics. Our team has really worked really hard to find some diagnostics that are easy to do at home, because we have an anxious dog, and then restraint for a needle or a blood draw is just not ideal for anyone. We're using what we have available. Free catch urine, stool samples, hair tissue samples. What can we learn about that physiologic being? Are we seeing subtle cystitis? Are we seeing small bleeds into the bladder when they're stressed? Are we seeing the GI system really having to process a lot of emotion? Are we seeing issues in skin? Are we seeing issues in the immune system? Because it takes a lot of work. As a facilitator, you know that it is physical body work to help a human regulate.
Yeah.
And so when an animal's doing that, it's the same for them.
Yeah, and you don't think about that too, because it could be, and it doesn't have to be psychedelics. It can be really almost anything. So
Absolutely.
I know our au pair just left after a year. She went back to Germany. So the house is quiet. And I know that when people move into new homes, there are all these things that we never really think about from animals' perspective of how they're being brought into a completely new situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there sensory deficit? Are they losing their sight? Are they losing their hearing? All of those things affect their experience. Here in Colorado, I serve on our disaster response team, and our hearts just ache for what's going on in California right now. And I'll just bring that into the conversation. Think about those natural disasters as stressors. If we as humans are stressed, think about that impact for the animal, whether they lost their family, maybe they are with their family, but the entire home was lost. That is a lot of change. And we as humans might not have the resources to support that other mammal in our household that doesn't understand what's happening. We see this a lot after earthquakes when you can't explain what's going on. Well, there's a tremor and the animals are just as nervous as the child is. And it's a really important thing for us to keep in mind. In our medical records, we have disaster exposed and psychedelic adjacent as diagnosis codes. It tells us a lot about what the animal's at risk for. Bladder disease, GI disease, any of that. So it definitely is something that we need to pay attention to medically.
So we were talking about this before in our first conversation, and it was fascinating because one of the things that you said is because there's been this increase of cannabis and psychedelic legality and usage, as you're seeing in exponentially higher amounts of harmful incidences with pets.
Yes.
And this is a lot of what we were talking about at the very beginning with harm reduction.
Yes.
Kind of walk me through some of that, because that's something, again, I had, and I think I shared a story with you. I had a call from someone saying, hey, my autistic son just broke into my bag and ate a 4-gram candy bar. Well, first he said he ate a candy bar. And I said, well, how much are we talking about? And he had to go find a wrapper. I'm like, it's going to be a rough night. He's nonverbal. So just go get some art and let's draw. But we can't do that with pets. So are we seeing this? Because to me, I mean, it would make sense.
We are definitely seeing it. I'll address first just got into the stash. And it happens with cannabis. Animals are very clever at opening doors. They are very interested in anything that we're interested in. Again, I'm in Colorado, so everyone is growing psilocybin. It's just very common to have. But if you're touching something and messing with something and interacting with something, your Labrador wants to know what you're doing. And they're going to be exploratory and they're going to be curious. So just that piece of harm reduction, being aware that your animal is curious and is great at climbing and opening doors, just to make sure that that's safe is a huge piece of it. And then also, if an animal does get into something, an accidental ingestion, and we also see malicious ingestion as well. I'll just mention that. So in an accidental case, the chocolate is way more dangerous for the animal than the psilocybin is, just like the cannabis side. So chocolate, caffeine, xylitol, all of those things that we usually put into the bar or the cookie or whatever can actually be way more deadly. And I see so much chocolate use in some of these ceremony spaces, and also just physical risk. In the veterinary ER clinic, the number of animals that come in because they got kicked or stepped on or fell on, accidental, but just safety, like the physical aspect of being safe when a human is undergoing a psychedelic experience, I think is really important. If they have an accidental exposure, thinking about those 2 to 3 weeks afterwards, we definitely see new behavioral health issues arise that weren't there before because we're not guiding that experience. So what we talked about for humans, all that importance of integration, if we're just like, I hope you have a good time, then that's just unethical and so dangerous. But I'll mention this just in our harm reduction conversation. The potential of neglect adjacent to human psychedelic use is actually really high. And if you're not thinking about your animal needing to go to the bathroom, needing to have a drink of water, your psychedelic trip is probably going to last longer than the time your animal's okay without you. So an ayahuasca experience, 8 to 10 hours, your animal needs you at some time within that. And so making accommodations for them, making sure they have what they need, making sure there's someone who can take care of them if something goes wrong, if they get sick, if they need to leave, just making space for them is one of the biggest things we can do to keep them safe.
Yeah, because I read somewhere a lot of pets too have gotten in the stash, they've thrown up. It's not uncommon for a dog to eat its own vomit again, but then kind of repeating the cycle, and they could actually get sick again.
Well, human vomit also. If you have,
so especially the purge with ayahuasca.
Absolutely. Yeah. And psilocybin pieces, even after they've been in the stomach, are still active. Vomit can be psychoactive when it has those molecules in it. So even thinking about those pieces, if there is a likelihood the human's going to vomit, make sure they're vomiting in something that you can tie up and put away. Just not expecting the animal to understand all the bits and pieces of what's going on, and absolutely letting them leave if they need to. We usually say if it's not appropriate for a 3 to 4 year old child, it's probably not appropriate for the animal unless they are specifically trained as a therapy animal. It's a lot going on for them.
That makes a lot of sense. So think about it as a 2, 3, 4-year-old child. And that's another conversation that I've had with so many people, that giving it to a teenager. Or I know there's been research about giving ketamine for anxiety and things on teens. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, as far as the pets going, they cause distress. And it's the critical period that, again, we never really think about, that I find so interesting with dogs, especially because they are so close to the bond of humans.
Yeah.
We had a cat, and I know you have a cat. Do they bond the same?
Depends on the cat. Depends on what the cat wants to do. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, cats are like, whatever I want to do. Like, I'll come to you when I need you, and let's call that a day.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually hear a lot of stories about cats that are themselves healers, and they're just amazing beings of their own. But we also hear about a lot of cats that are really struggling, because most of the time people working with psychedelics in home, maybe there's a cat. Cats are very, very sensitive to the emotional environment and the chaos around them. And I'll say that probably the number one behavioral health complaint I receive from humans who are not being careful with their animals in their home, more back to the dog, is just being afraid of strangers. So barking incessantly at anyone coming over, UTIs, things like that. So we see this subtle around those major health concerns. So small changes as the body's trying to compensate. But if you're paying attention, it's actually really easy to track those. What's going on? Why are you nervous about new people coming over? Oh, maybe that's because what happens next is really disconcerting for you. And I have seen some abuse cases, and I've definitely I know a little dog who lost her life because she was adjacent to psychedelic experience. So we're definitely talking about a life and death issue for some of these animals.
So how do we ensure safety, not only for humans but for animals themselves?
Yeah. Well, being a human like yourself who asked the question is the first way to start. Just being aware is absolutely the most powerful way you can advocate for your animal. Unless they have specific therapy dog training, we say they should not be present in a psychedelic ceremony. And if they are, being really careful to follow up with them the next day. So you as a facilitator, making sure that your bond is reestablished, that your animal knows where they are and who their family is and what the normal baselines are, is a really great way to help them feel more settled. Stress testing, urine testing, stool testing, just making sure that we're really tracking some behavioral health issues and make sure that we see any changes there. And then being aware that if we make a change, if we decide to do something different, we need to pay more attention to what that animal's signaling back to us, because especially as they age, things can change. The animal that was okay with a all-night experience when they were younger, there's different things that their bodies need. Or as their organs age, they might need a little bit more support, need to go out to the bathroom more often. So I think I'll go back to that first
times a night. Yes.
First phrase of just being aware that they have their own experience and that they are a separate, other beautiful being who's in partnership with us, but that human animal bond carries weight on both sides. And if we're not being responsible about our weighted side, what we're doing, how much we're pulling, if we're not giving back, then it definitely can be a harmful scenario.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pneuma, the crossroad of science and enlightenment. We hope you're enjoying the deep dive into psychedelics, neuroplasticity, and the path to transformation. Before we continue, let's discuss recovery. After powerful experiences, your mind deserves more than just rest. It needs real support. That's where Pneuma Hydrate comes in. Formulated with GABA, taurine, inositol, magnesium, and more, Pneuma Hydrate is designed to help your brain recover faster and support neuroplasticity, giving you the clarity and the energy to fully embrace your journey. Fuel your recovery and elevate your mind with Pneuma Hydrate. Check out pneuma.health to learn more. Now, enjoy the rest of the episode. He heard us talking about him, so he came in and then he just left.
Just letting you know that I was here, guys.
Yeah. Still alive. And it's an interesting experience too, because we were talking about as they get older. So his sight at night, in the dark, he doesn't see as well. Super, not afraid, but he is cautious.
Yeah.
So it's knowing that, hey, I've got you. I pick him up and I carry him into the bed because he sleeps with us.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's just those like the little things of noticing and asking the right question.
Yeah. Being aware. And it takes time. It means that you have to have space in your day to ask, how are you today? Why is this bathroom break taking longer? Why are you not jumping up? And if we get so carried away by our own chaos, it is really hard to hear those small, soft voices that might be asking for help.
As you're saying that, it's funny. We moved into this house about a year and 3 months ago. We brought him to the build. So it was kind of cool. Like he got to see it, had no idea what it was. And then we moved in, and I remember the night that we moved in, we used to have a fence in our old house, and he had a dog door, and he could just come in and out as he wanted. He was like a cat. Like he could just go out and come back in, and we clean it in the morning. It was totally fine.
Yeah.
And then I opened up the slider to let him out, and we live now surrounded by woods, and didn't see him. Like I had no idea where he was. So it's like 2:30 in the morning, and I'm like, Jasper. Like I'm trying. Like, I don't want to wake anybody else. I have no idea where he's at. Now I'm like, oh my God, he got away. Like first night, and I'm like, I'm terrified, and I'm walking everywhere. I have no shoes on. He's sitting next to me. And he's looking at me like, what? Like I'm right. Like where am I going? Like, and it was so funny because I had all this anxiety. He was just sitting there, and he's never once from the moment we moved in, never ran, never. He'll walk around the entire 2 acres, and he'll just find his way home, and he's totally cool. But my anxiety, I wore it that day. Yeah.
I hear you. I empathize with that. My cat, when he was younger, used to love to jump into the fridge when I wouldn't see him, and I was so scared I would always lock him in. Man, the things they bring to our lives, I just tell you, they are what a privilege to live adjacent to them. But man, they give me heartburn sometimes.
Yes. Hey everyone, I'm just catching everybody up to speed. So I have with me Dr. Casara Andre. We had to cut this little short last Friday, and I did not want to miss any of this conversation. But we were talking about what a privilege it was to live next to incredible animals. You were talking about your cat. I was talking about my dog, and we were just talking about this test that you were working on, that you have been working on.
Yeah.
I'm talking about work schedules, and I want to talk about that because I think that was one of the things that we were talking about last week was how do we educate like people around all of the things we don't think about? You know, I can tell you from personal experience after we left the conversation, I kept looking at Jasper different. Like I did. I said to my kids, I'm like, do you guys realize when you run around the house like maniacs, like he doesn't like, so it really did like all day. I really kind of thought about that, which was why I feel like this is kind of an important conversation to have. So walk me through again, because I know you have these incredible organizations that you support, and you were working over the weekend, and you had created this test. So let's talk about the test. Sorry about that. I'm just like super excited about this.
Well, I'm excited too. It's like I mentioned as we were just chatting beforehand. It's the culmination of a lot of different projects and different things into one very specific thing. And it's sometimes much easier to speak to a pet parent, especially if there's a lot going on. And I'll explain why that is important in a moment. When you have a thing that you can talk about and just that objectness, we're finding it really useful to get conversations started, to create some advocacy, etc. So yes, one of my businesses is a co-working ecosystem that supports medical entrepreneurs. And that means that a lot of the practitioners in our group are working with non-traditional practices, non-traditional medicine. When I work with cannabis, I work within that system, or psychedelics. So it just creates an ecosystem for people not to have to do some of the background things, just like a co-working space on the business side, just for
Are there a lot
side.
of non-traditional spaces? I mean,
Sure.
There is, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much fun to talk about that from a palliative care perspective, counseling, grief, human-animal bond work. There's so much that needs to be done in person with a non-verbal creature. You just have to have that connection. But from a education, family unit, dynamics, problem solving, it's really fun to interact virtually. So that's mostly what I do professionally, is just medical problem solving. But it means that you get to interface with friends and colleagues from around the globe. I was speaking with one of our students from Switzerland this morning, and it's just amazing to be a health practitioner in today's world.
Cool. So talk about the test, because I didn't mean to throw you off there. I was just kind of like,
No,
As
I
was
can go.
thinking
I
about
can
that-
go down any. I'll
Well,
follow
and I
any
was thinking
rabbit
about
down
that
the
too, because
hole.
I was like, we don't really ever talk or think about these kind of things. Again, kind of having the conversation we did the other day, just the purview of what their surroundings are and how they interpret different what we do. Kind of going back to that, and then you think about the non-traditional therapies. So there was a 60-minute. I don't know if you saw the 60-minute episode last night with Jesse Gould and Heroic Hearts. It's like super amazing.
Yeah.
About how they have to go down to Mexico for all of this non-traditional healing. And it kind of got me thinking about the conversation we were having. So,
Yeah, well, actually, that's an amazing conversation to pull in. So a lot of this also circles towards our work with the canine veteran. So some of what's being explored for supporting the human veteran side, we're curious if that can also be extrapolated to the canine veteran. But how do you do that ethically in a nonverbal creature is kind of the center of the conversation. And that applies in that case as well. How do you know that they're doing okay? Because an animal, as you know from your own, the thing they want in life is to be with you. And so they're probably going to tuck away that hurt. They're going to tuck away that anxiety. They're going to show up. And as conscious animal guardians, I think our question is always, how do I know? I want to know if you're upset. I want to know if you're stressed. I want to be able to advocate or take action for you. And so from a veterinarian's perspective, one of the easiest things to put there is as a diagnostic test, just an assay that gives us an objective number that we can chart over time. And this is really important in behavior work because there are so many factors that are involved. But if we can assess whether their body is physically stressed and then implement something like cannabis, training, massage, change the family unit dynamics a little bit, and then ask again, are you stressed? Is there cortisol? We use a little fecal test for that. Is there cortisol in your feces? Tell us more. It gives us a lot to base our treatment modalities on, our treatment progression, our planning, and then gives me a lot of information to be able to say to the pet parents, maybe here's how we should shape what we're doing or what we might want to look for down the road. So there's a couple of tests in that program that I can chat about, but they all come down to that same piece of, can we really know? Can we ask a nonverbal creature, are you doing okay? And many times we can if we look at how their body's functioning and listen there.
how many veterinarians would you say are trained in this? Or should all veterinarians be trained in some sort? Because I'm just thinking as I take Jasper vet, I'm fortunate because we had the same vet for all 3 of their lives, so they know them very, very well. But I'm just thinking, I don't know, these are conversations that I've ever really had. And I've had 2 seniors that unfortunately crossed to the Rainbow Bridge, but I don't remember having these conversations.
Yeah, well, hospice care, palliative care are 2 areas that have really expanded in veterinary medicine, just like in the human side of medicine. And it's an area that requires a lot of very close listening. So I think some of these at bedside tests, which is a really important differentiation of what it allows us to do, have kind of come from that desire of the pet parents to know a little bit more. How can we ask a little bit more closely? But a lot of these tests that are now available, it used to only be at a reference lab or within a research structure. So we also see just development of science, which is amazing, to make it really easy for something that you can have. And I love that because I think just the ability to put some advocacy in the pet parents' hands so that you can look at your animal and say, something seems different. I feel like I should know a little bit more about what's going on. That's really what can trigger next a conversation with a veterinarian or a care team member. But we're really interested in giving the pet parent a lot of tools because you're in that bond with your animal all the time and you know what the stressors are. You can kind of anticipate.
Yeah, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about just like how we created Numa. I mean, we created it because we kept seeing the stressors, we kept seeing how the body needed this neuroplasticity, but there really isn't. As I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, is there anything even like this for pets? I don't think there is.
No, you should consider a pet line. Yeah. There are some products for sporting animals, and I would consider it really close along those lines. How do we support that physical shell that holds their spirit and their soul and their desire to engage with the world? And that's really the purview of what I love to work on and the veterinarian's role of making sure that that body is okay. And again, I think that parallels with sort of your mission for the human side. And it's really amazing what we can do with supplements, what we can do with therapeutic touch, what we can do with just awareness. But sometimes we need to ask a little bit further. I would say that cystitis, so inflammation of the bladder, is something that we see really commonly. And many times in a traditional clinic practice, like a brick and mortar, I might only see that when it's so bad that they're peeing in the house. But there's a lot that is in between. For a house trained animal to go to the bathroom in the house, that's a lot of stress and they're not happy about it. So it tells me that we missed a lot in between and we could have intervened earlier. And also we maybe could have prevented some of the longer term chronic diseases. And that's where it ties into your senior pet. What can we do in their younger years?
Yeah, that's interesting because I know, like, I watch him. He's obviously being older. He has had a few accidents, but you watch him like loop around the room because he knows where to go, and it's like, so sorry. That you kind of. So, how do you differentiate between recreational and therapeutic use for cannabis or for? Because I can imagine some of the listeners thinking, "Well, my dog might have anxiety. It's just a dog. I'm going to go check, or I'm not going to check, and I'm just going to give them cannabis or psychedelic." So, how do we differentiate?
Yeah. Well, first, just a strong statement of do not give your animal any psychoactive substance, which includes pharmaceuticals, cannabis, psychedelics, without a really intentional therapeutic plan and really intentional monitoring in place, because there are so many, this is powerful medicine. And we know that from the human side. And then adding it in that unknown to the veterinary medicine side, it requires a lot of ethical approach and a lot of slow conversation. We'll say, and then I'll dive back into your question, I do think there's a lot of therapeutic potential in severe behavioral disorders, canine PTSD, pain. I think it has applications there, but it needs to be done within the structure, like we know from the human side of what are we trying to shape this system into? What's our goal for the nervous system? What's actually wrong? What are we, having actually a treatment plan? So whenever we think about giving any substance in a medical context versus you use the term recreational, and that kind of comes from words we use with the cannabis industry and psychedelic industry. Right. But I would more differentiate, do we have a medical intention or not? And then within the not could be a malicious ingestion, accidental ingestion. It could be an unintentional, something that the pet parent gave. So there's a lot that can go under that. Like, we didn't do it with a lot of intention. But on the other side, when we work with cannabis, we really dive into which molecules are useful in that particular case. And we have the whole slew of them: CBD, THC, CBDA, all of those. And when we do it really carefully with a really, really safe product, we see animals respond in some beautiful ways. So I think the answer that I would give to your question is the differentiating factor is having a medical plan, having a treatment progression, and not just waiting to see what happens, because you're making a powerful intervention in that animal's body and psyche and need to have the ethical responsibility to follow it up or to guide it.
So I think it's even like just the intention behind it. I think you hit it so beautifully, because it really is like, what are we trying to do here? Because there's got to be an intention for the plan.
Yeah.
And I see so many times we'll even jump into either CBD or psychedelic therapy without a plan. There is no intentions, because I always hear it's always somebody had a roommate in college who had something. It's never like I just went on, I was like, I have a friend. And it's like, so there's always like I have a friend in college and they did, or we were on a roof and it's always on a roof or at a party. And it's like, okay, so you really just kind of went on a trip without any kind of intentions or guide or anything else. So I would definitely classify that as really more about recreation. So, yes, but even thinking this in context for our pets. So really kind of looking at them and creating attention about what should there be, trying to figure out how I want to word this. Should there always be a consult with a veterinarian if I think I'm going to go down this road? So I know my pet, I see they're struggling. I have the intention of wanting to be therapeutic. Is there something that I could do on my own, or is it something I really should be? I think I would responsibly and ethically say I need to call my doctor and have a conversation, but I'm kind of curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a powerful question, and one that I appreciate a lot, because I have the privilege of working with pet parents that are on an amazing spectrum of interest. And there might be psychedelic facilitators, there might be pet parents who have no interest in biology or a background there, all the way to colleagues who are just embedded in veterinary medicine. So I always try to bring that conversation back to consent from the animal and really participating in cooperative care as much as possible. So it kind of takes back to, what's the goal? what's the purpose here? And is there a way that we can make sure that this is the direction the animal wants to go? And I think a lot of people will stay there and be like, is that true? Is that possible? I don't think an animal can consent. But I think as a very bonded pet parent with an animal who tells you how he feels all the time, really, we just have to know how to ask the question. So should you consider really any medical modality without speaking with the clinician, whoever that is in your area of practice? Probably not if there are multiple conditions overlying. So if you have something that is simple and progressive, let's think osteoarthritis in a dog, you can learn as a pet parent what you need to know about their endocannabinoid system. You can learn really easily what you need to know about some of those basic molecules, CBD being a really safe one to work with. And importantly, journaling is a way that you get to interface kind of what you want to try as a pet parent with something that you can bring to me and say, it didn't work. Or it didn't work the way I wanted to, or I want to try a different goal, because then that gives me a lot of information about how those past days have gone with the with the animal. And a lot of times we'll suggest that pet parents do that, to start with something therapeutic touch, a CBD dominant product on their own, but to journal and make sure that they're feeding that information back to their clinic team. Now, for the psychedelic side, no. This should not be something that anyone pursues without veterinary guidance, because even at the veterinarian level, we are trying to approach this really carefully. There's so much to be considered from a consent perspective and just a physiology. How do we care for their bodies and avoid the traumatic trip? I mean, that I think would just be unethical for us not to be thinking about. So really, it's a question of what are your molecules? What's the modality? What kind of education do you have as a pet parent or seeking as a pet parent? And then kind of what is that animal's consent and the safety for them in the midst of it? Does that answer the question?
It does. And I feel it does, and more, because then it got me thinking too, because a lot of it, I think, it really depends on the state. Like, you're fortunate because you live in Colorado. I know in DC it's decrimmed. You can purchase under a different, you can ask for buy one thing and you get something else. And I know that Maryland's evaluating, but I know there's like 14 states that are in different progress. So I imagine states like Oregon, Colorado that are legal, that it has a difference. Because I know even here in Maryland, it's CBD is legal, THC is legal, but I never checked about how it works with animals. So could I go into a medical dispensary on behalf of my pet if it's legal here?
Not yet. There are a couple of states that have gotten really close to including veterinarians on that ability to write a recommendation. And you really begin to dive into a lot of the tangled nuance of just terminology in the cannabis world. So really at the base of it is most states that have a medical card program, a medical license program, when they state which clinicians can write a recommendation. Veterinarians are not yet included at any state level for that. So I'm not in your state, but just for example, I could not write a card for your animal so that you could take it into a dispensary and access some of those products. And California came really close. I think New York came really close. So it's really just a matter of recognizing veterinary professionals as clinicians that carry DEA licenses and sort of that, but the policy writers on the cannabis side weren't necessarily interfacing with the animals world. There was just a lot of disconnect among the licensing. Does that make sense? Sometimes the terminology
it totally makes sense, because now do they teach any of this in veterinarian school with alternative therapies, modalities, palliative care, hospice, CBD? Is any of this taught?
Slightly, and it's beginning to be more so. Veterinary school is a basic systems review and basic standard of care medicine and really getting your basics down. And then we find a lot of the specialty practices, where I would put cannabis, is sort of where a lot of this is emerging now, because you have clinicians that are looking for something. That was definitely me. My patient needed something that I didn't have. And you just sort of start on this journey of, okay, well, let's figure it out, because obviously we need it. And so I think you kind of see that those type of modalities emerge there. But yes, especially learning about the endocannabinoid system. It is a master regulatory system in all mammals. So yes, it is starting to be in a lot more curriculums.
Do you think there are ways that we can reduce some of the stigma around cannabis use and psychedelic therapy, knowing that it takes a very skilled professional to be able to do both? Do you think there are ways to reduce some of that?
I do. I think that if we can change the perspective to be less about the human and change that to be slightly more about the family unit or the shared bonds that that human has, we can reduce some of the stigma that exists around why a human would change their psychology. Why would you mess with your psyche? And if you just look at that alone, sometimes that's really difficult to have someone else understand, and the stigma kind of comes up, and then policies around that. But I think if we looked more from a clinician's perspective towards patients that are really looking for some type of healing and thought about what can these molecules do in non-humans, it gives us an opportunity to really contrast why are we doing this in the human. And so then that goes back to why are we doing it in the animal. But if we're really pursuing medical use in the animal side and we see it work and we see an animal be not painful or we see it control their seizures, many times that can feed back into changing the human's mindset around cannabis. And I will say that many times humans will not want to pursue something for themselves, but if it can help their beloved animal, they're game. Tell me more. Send me a paper to read. And those are my favorite clients of just.
That's very interesting. I would not have expected that because I know on this side, it's something that you always hear on CBD is drugs. Psychedelics are, there's no way it's a drug. And I will admit, prior to all of the work that I did, I felt the same way. I mean, I can hear and see images of Nancy Reagan talking about how drugs are bad and how we had dare trucks and police cars. And but I guess I never would have equated that to pets. So that is an interesting observation.
It makes us step outside of our paradigms a bit. And sometimes you have to be okay with not knowing. When we're working with humans, we just really want to know. And we're quite proud of thinking we have the answer. But when you have to approach something that's non-human, you have to have a lot of respect around, I might not know the answer, but I have a goal and I have a successful outcome. This little animal has a better life that I think just gives you a really interesting perspective on what you decide to pursue.
Yeah, it does, because I think, one, it goes back to the intention side. Why am I doing it? Two, then you begin to ask the questions that are not the hard questions you have to ask yourself. So why do I feel this way? Why do I have this anxiety? No one really wants to go deep into the answers. We were kind of joking about this thing I went to this weekend. And it's like we would rather just kind of move on with our lives and not really take a step and try to understand the work. I'm a big fan of Byron Katie, the author who has a process called The Work. And most of the time, the stories that we're telling ourselves are past stories of past programming of future events that haven't even happened yet. We're not even looking in the present. So we're creating these scenarios in our minds that aren't real, but in our mind, they feel very, very real. But I can see how with my pet, I have more compassion because they're helpless. There's that bond that's different, but it doesn't take the responsibility of my own person. I can go give it to something else. It's kind of a fascinating thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about monitoring results, again, going back to our diagnostic testing, but we can really easily ask the question, is this helping? And we don't see that question being asked on the recreational side. So whatever that means in that big tangle, again, I think that a differentiating factor is, are we charting the progress? Do we know where we're going? Are we willing to change if it's not working? And you and I have chatted a little bit about some of the concerns I have in watching the human psychedelic side of the industry emerge. I am concerned that question is not being asked enough. Is this helpful? Should we change something else? Because it's so easy, especially with psychedelics, to be caught in this change of your psyche, and really difficult for that patient to even know. But that's all the time in animals. So just treating a lot of respect towards that patient, journaling really carefully, and being willing to change course, I think is the mark of a medical paradigm, is being willing to say, that's not working. Let's look for something else. Yeah, hopefully that.
I think that is so incredibly important, not only for pets, but for. And I think you are right. I think the bigger issue we have is that we have these amazing experiences as people, and we refuse to really take the integration seriously. Or oftentimes that's what I see is I'll have somebody that I work with who will come from somewhere else. They'll pay a ton of money. They get a couple of phone calls, and then you're like, congrats. And it's like, wait, it's just beginning.
I'm just starting.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, so I often have times I have people, and then I'm like, are you journaling? No, I'm not. Well, if you're not having a daily reflection of yourself and really understanding exactly what you're saying, is this working? What am I trying to get out of this? But to be able to do that with your pet, I mean, that's incredibly insightful because we don't really look at the changes in a factual way. We're able to document those and hand those to you, which again, I'm going to look at Jasper as I'm journaling in the morning and we're like, just going to start writing some Jasper
Absolutely.
stuff.
Absolutely. Well, Alan, if we take a moment to go down that thought trail, I'll say that that is actually more the core of what I, as a practitioner, and a lot of the programs are interested in tackling. There's a lot of harm reduction that we're doing now, and that's just a lot needs to be said. Be really careful, consent, ethics, all of that. But on the therapeutic side, when we think about, okay, past the harm reduction piece, when we can really look at this question and access to these amazing medicinal molecules and a creature that is a mammal, just like a human is, that shares this incredible bond, can we actually leverage that animal's well-being towards the well-being of their human? So it's sort of working backwards. And I'd love to hear your perspective on this as a facilitator.
Yeah,
so
because we were talking about this the other day on just the experience of the home. Like if you show me an anxious home, I will show you an anxious pet.
Yes.
Same thing. So, and I think you hit it so well the other day when we were talking about the anxiety in a home and how your bond really is reflective of that. I can tell just not only because he's a senior, but I can tell when the kids are running around or they were stressed in the house. They know. And we have such a huge mental health epidemic right now.
Yes.
And I think that is overwhelmingly having an impact on pets, which is why I found this conversation so fascinating, because I see a lot of the same work that should be being done with our best friends that we're not really even willing to do ourselves. And until we can kind of look at it holistically as one unit, me taking care of my best friend or my best friend taking care of myself, or doing it for me, I feel like that's the conversation that needs to happen. So as a facilitator, you kind of walk into it with, I think we have all these expectations of magic pills. I mean, just even the term magic mushroom. There is no magic in the mushroom. People who are listening, there's no magic in the mushroom. There's not. It lowers the default mode network and it allows you to actually see what's going on in your life free of ego. That is it. The real work becomes afterwards. It's like, how do we take that critical period, and how do we make the changes? How do we take the journaling every day for our pet or ourselves? So, I mean, do you agree?
I do, absolutely. In the scenario you're speaking about of having just a column in your journal for how is your animal today? I can imagine as a human facilitator that little column gives you so much of a window into what's unspoken by your client. Because many times when you're asking how I am, well, I am okay. But that doesn't mean that I felt like getting up and going for a walk this morning or yesterday, or that I felt like doing these things that would help my progress be faster. But if you can ask me about, did you and your animal go for a walk? What did you do on the walk? What did you see? What did your dog experience? I think that those types of questions can actually give you, as a human facilitator, a much broader picture of what's going on in the household. And then I would love to put some testing of the animal. So let's test some cortisol levels in your animal before you start, after you go through this experience, to make sure that they're still okay. But then also I would expect that this animal's stress level would go down as their human leans into that bond more. Now, we don't fully know that. We know all the edges of it. We see when it goes poorly. We see when humans improve because the animals are. So there's just pieces that we need to put together. Yeah. And I think psychedelic medicine really offers us an opportunity, a One Health opportunity, to look at all the parts that are tied so closely together.
I love that, because as a facilitator, I'm thinking, normally when you have these incredible changes, everything looks brighter, everything is happier, you're much more excited and engaged. And if you're going to sit down and have a column for your pet, it's just going to make you smile. And I think it's, if anything, I think it's going to be heart opening. And then you're going to be able to really objectively look at, am I making those changes? Because I a long time ago, when I worked in worksite wellness, if somebody said I needed to lose weight, well, that's easy. Buy a dog. Like, dogs love to be walked. So walk the dog. And I've actually had people they lived alone and they didn't have
Mm,
anyone. And I remember having a neighbor and he lost 114 pounds because his dog loved to go for walks,
yeah.
but he found a bond. He found something that was much deeper than the walk. So I kind of relate that to the same kind of a thing. You want to be happy and you've gone through whatever the CBDs or whatever the modality we're talking about, an animal. So, and then document how they feel. I think that's going to have a really big impact on you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I will again be the veterinarian and mention a thing that we do see actually happen not unfrequently on the negative side of that, because it just bears us being really aware. If a human patient pursuing any modality is not supported sufficiently by their human team, and we don't have an appropriate bond formed with that animal, or simply the human is just not able to take care of themselves and an animal, there is actually a really big abuse potential or primary trauma that increases dramatically. We know from some great statistics that if an animal is being abused, people in the home are being abused. And a lot of that comes from mental health disorders in the family unit, any of that. And so if we are not supporting that family unit and provisioning the humans too, as a patient is undergoing changes, I think that you know enough about dog behavior and behavioral disorders in animals or just medical conditions that can be a really hard pairing with a human that's also struggling. And unfortunately, that can result in neglect, in abuse, again, if that human isn't supported well. And so I do have concerns about a lot of humans pursuing psychedelic therapy, really looking for that healing, but maybe not getting the support enough that they need so that the people, the bonds, the animals that rely on them, there may not be enough capacity. What are your thoughts on that? I'd love to hear your perspective there.
I truthfully never even considered it.
Hmm.
I know that for me, when I work with someone, kind of alluded to the fact that right now, the integration is the hardest. It's the
Yeah.
hardest part. You have these people who will go off on these incredible retreats and they will spend insane amounts of money and they get 2 calls or 4 calls. And then, all right, congratulations, you graduated. Well, oftentimes with the critical period, it could be 6 months.
Yes.
And it could be 30 days for pets. No one's addressing that. So I know that when I work with somebody, I want to work with them every week. I want to work with them every week for at least 6 months because we know
Yes.
based on Prochaska stages of change, it becomes a habit. But I've never asked the questions about pets. Like and as we're talking, I'm writing down like there's so many things now that I want to add into how I do this or how I educate other people into facilitating because that is a huge hole in what we're doing right now.
I think it definitely is a hole with some danger to animals. But again, I'll emphasize if we sort of push past that could be bad, I think we don't even understand the potential of really leaning into that bond, especially when we are thinking about psychedelic therapy. Are you familiar with surrogate healing term in
No.
human psychedelic world? I learned about it through some work from Adele Frank, and I believe that it's sort of she's the leader in the idea. Essentially, it is that someone else can interact with a psychedelic for the patient. Does that make sense? So maybe the patient is too fragile to travel or their medical condition, it isn't possible to interact with a psychedelic. And so there's some idea around a surrogate, usually a closely bonded human to them, interacting with the psychedelic, et cetera. Does that make sense as an idea?
100%.
So I have had a couple of cases where the owner, and I agreed, felt that their stress and their life circumstances, they had been significantly supported by their animal just through that event. But that was not, when the human was okay and out of that scenario, there was not an effective telling of the animal, we're okay now. And so I end up seeing these animals because there's usually GI disease, urinary disease, musculoskeletal disease, just all the things we can imagine that could kind of come as a result. But I have, in a couple of cases, explored not the animal receiving the psychedelic, but really asking and working with the human to explore, how can I keep this bond hygienic? How can I let go of whatever I'm carrying so that my animal's not carrying that for me. And you can view that in any light. It can be the actual emotion, thought that human's dealing with, or just your animal reading your stress level. So all those pieces, I think that's really interesting to explore is how physical is this bond? We see it, we know it, we experience it, but I don't think that we are really leaning into that yet as medical practitioners. I'd love to hear your thoughts
because
on that.
I know, like, typically we always tell people when you had your experiences, oh, go home and rest for a couple of days. But we never really think about the reduction time or what the signals are that you're giving to going home. So yeah, I've never heard of that, but I could see that it's very it almost equates it back to, as we were talking about Friday, the dump truck. Like when your dog hears a dump truck, we're like, oh yeah, it's a dump truck. We can, but your dog, like, ironically, I saw a dump truck and I thought of that. I was like, yeah, so I'm telling my kids. So very similar.
Absolutely. I'm working with one little new patient who is a canine patient who is experiencing some dissociative episodes. He's come from a shelter, been surrendered a couple of times, and so just like we would see in a human, we're seeing that stress level in his nervous system require that his body and mind separate for a little bit. So he can't anyway. It's a really interesting case. But what's fascinating is when we have him in clinic and are using cannabis and we're trying to create this scenario where he does feel safe and his pet parents are there, we're doing therapeutic touch. We're really trying to reintegrate his mental concept of the world with what he experiences and in his body. But I was thinking about him the other day because he was just resting super quietly, had just had his massage, was just really in a great place. But I have no control over the sounds that are in the road. And I actually mentioned to the pet parents, this is the time where I'm glad he's resting, but we want to create resiliency in this nervous system. We don't want him to be so much on edge that if there was a loud sound outside now, his body says, all right, that's it. I'm never going to be safe again. Every time I sleep, and that's really a big potential to have happen when they don't understand what's going on in our world. So I approach a lot of my cases, yes, with modalities, but making sure that that patient is strongly connected to the humans around them so that as they're human, you can say, it's okay. We're fine. I know what that was. Let's continue on with our walk. And so really trusting and leaning onto that bond. And I think that that's been successful. What's really been successful in a lot of cases.
That's almost surrogate resiliency.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Talking about that, that's what I'm thinking. I know he always looks to me to like, is this cool?
Your vote, Dad. Good or bad?
So, I know, good or bad. So
I'm going to go with whatever you say.
So if we could fast forward 10 years, where do you see it? Like, where do we think it's going to be from pet side? I think I know where it's going to be. Or at least I think I know where it's going to be with adults.
I'd love to hear.
I really believe that we're at an interesting place where I do believe it will be legal. I do believe
we're talking about psychedelics.
Psychedelics. And I mean, we're already seeing it with cannabis. So we're already seeing, as I said before, there are 14 states. We're seeing 240 studies across the world that are studying the psychedelic positive effects. We already know what they were from the 60s. I don't want to get into the historical part of any of that, but I do believe that they will be legal with guidelines in the next 10 years. I think we just kind of reached a tipping point. I think the SSRIs are not getting it done. I think it's just a global epidemic. Politics aside, because I don't care about any of that stuff, I just feel like we have reached a tipping point where people are desperate for. And I'm curious what that's going to look like for pets.
Yeah. I think a lot of what the pet landscape will look like depends on the success of humans moderating our next actions in all aspects, whether that be how the industry expands, the policies that are created around it. Animals carry our risks and they carry the results of our decisions passively, and they don't have an opportunity to speak their own voice into that. So there's a lot of responsibility on us to consider all of these pieces for them. I'm concerned currently because some of this interest in psychedelics, like 5-MeO, has really jeopardized a species where we have an animal that is close to extinction and ecosystems that are destroyed because of a substance that it creates. They can also be milked. That doesn't need to have the death of the animal involved in it. So our ability to moderate the thing that we're seeking, I think, is really what dictates
the positive or negative next things that come up on the, go ahead, comment.
No, yes, because I feel like we're at a place in science where we can duplicate the molecule without having to put the animal in extinction. So, and I struggle with the Samoan toad as well. I mean, that's one of the things you're hearing it in rainforest too with ayahuasca and the vine of all of the things that are happening. Well, searching for healing. So, I mean, now we're making bio gummies and all the kinds of, I mean, we do what Americans do best. Like we try to find hacks and then we ruin everything. But how do we do it responsibly?
Yeah. I don't have the exact answer, but my team would like to propose that simply shifting from that anthropocentric, the human-centric idea would give us a wealth of things to pursue other than this really obsessively fast forward driving pattern that we kind of tend to fall into, because it requires us to slow down and not lean on huge threshold doses, so much on one molecule, but really instead talks about the community that you're in, the social network, how is your resiliency with the things and animals and humans that you're bonded to around you. But what's fascinating is that we already know that that is the solution. Whether you have an illness, whether you have cancer and recuperating, whether you have all of that healing requires community and it requires connection. So I believe that if we can really emphasize the connectedness and the resiliency that comes from networks that are not all the same species, that are interspecies healing, I think that that opens up so many doors for us. So in 10 years, what I would really like to see in specifically the psychedelic industry globally is a recognition of the impact that a human's physical and emotional state has on everything around them, that we have some really solid monitoring safety protocols for any animals that are adjacent to the human psychedelic experience, either their own owners pursuing it or a therapy dog, a service animal. And I'd also really love to see increased safety for really closely bonded pairs. And I'll explain what that means. So an animal that really spends their day with their owner and an owner that really needs this animal here. If that owner, that caregiver pursues a psychedelic where all of this changes, that can be really dangerous for this animal's psyche and physical being. Does that make sense? I'm happy to explain more.
Because it's almost like, where do I fit into this new version of, because you see it with adults. Like,
absolutely.
I had a friend tell me, I see your post, I see your change. How do I fit into all this? So I can't even imagine. I mean, that's a human who, for 20 years, not even close to the bond that you have.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So I would love to see an option for a really safe boarding plan, so that we can carefully, and I want to emphasize how much medically I mean this, carefully allow that bond to be stretched so the animal can be safely cared for while the human interacts with humans and whatever they need to heal. And then that we really intentionally, and again, I mean this in medical terms, carefully reintegrate that bond. So not just assuming that we're going to bond and everyone's going to be okay. Can we actually look at that and make sure that that bond is healthy? And then I think it fits into that integration plan. How is that unit doing? But I do think that we really need to emphasize space safety and allowing these animals to be separate from what are sometimes very, very violent, very tumultuous, sometimes humans need to get a lot out. And I think it can be a really unethical thing to let the animal experience that without the right safeties in place. Does that make sense? I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
100% agree with that, because you have so many versions of complex PTSD and complex trauma in a human that I think it would be, and I think it is, irresponsible. But I think what I've loved so much about this conversation is that we never think about that parameter or that purvey outside of our normal scope. Like we go off and we work on ourselves, have all this incredible healing. We come home. We want to integrate, but one of the things we always tell you is go home and rest.
Yes.
Take a couple of days off from work. Don't make any life-changing decisions. But there's this beautiful animal that's been attached to your life that we haven't even discussed how to integrate back to that. So this has been such an enlightening conversation.
It's so much fun on my side to participate. Thank you so much always for your animal heart. It is just a pleasure to talk to any human that has that conscious animal guardianship at their forefront. So thank you for all of your care.
My pleasure. And I think, again, the work that you're doing is amazing. I cannot wait to post some of the information of where we can find you in our links. I know I follow you on all of the other area projects that you're working on, which is amazing, but I'll post those in the links as well. And listeners, this is an important component that we've never really even think about, not only from a facilitation and integration standpoint, but just as a human, as this beautiful creature. Doesn't matter what it is, cat, dog, bird, horse, whatever. You have a connection and a responsibility to be able to not only integrate yourself, but think about those that are around you. So,
Really beautifully said.
Dr. Andre, thank you so much for your time. This is
Thank
Alan.
you.
This is Numa, and have a great day.